Welcome back to the Scarlet Faithful podcast. I'm Aaron Brightman, returning David Anderson to talk some Rutgers football today. But as always, this episode is brought to you by Knights of the Raritan, the Rutgers NIL Collective. Click on the link in the description of this episode to find out more about becoming a member, to supporting Rutgers with student athletes with NIL, as well as member activities and events that Knights of the Raritan has going on this fall and beyond. David Anderson, thanks so much for being back. We're talking big picture here with Rutgers football. I just had an episode come out in terms of great expectations. Rutgers, the buzzworthy pick as the sleeper surprise pick across college football in 2024. But one thing we wanted to talk about before things really got going here, early first week of training camp, was looking beyond the big picture with Rutgers football in 2025. Obviously, a senior-laden veteran team going into 2024. Recruiting is on the uptick. But what does this program look like moving forward? The impact of what this season has, not just on the actual results, but this program moving forward and what to look for in 24 that will help determine 2025. David Anderson, any initial thoughts on that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've hinted at this in several other recent podcasts about how yes, just like we're talking about with basketball, you kind of have to look at it as a one-year team, but at the same point, you're still a program that's going to go on into the future. And so you can't sacrifice wins now, because you have to show results. But at the same time, how do you just get guys in getting their playing time up so that you're prepared moving forward, and in the current time, just also for injuries? I think we've seen in recent years, sometimes Rutgers has been a little thin, especially at certain position groups, and then there was an injury and there was no one experienced behind them. So even if you're not, looking just towards the future and you're looking in the present, I mean, how do they phase some guys in to, balance both the present and the future? And that's really a big challenge for a coaching staff, and one of the things that makes football such an interesting sport.
Yeah, great point. Let's bounce around position groups, looking about what their depth chart looks like in 2024 and what that means for the future in terms of 2025. We'll start with defensive backs. Obviously, a senior-laden, very experienced group, both cornerbacks and the safety group. What are your thoughts there, just in terms of how that group looks beyond?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one because when you start, all 5 projected starters are in their final season of eligibility. So obviously, there's always a scenario where a player may be injured and get an extra year because of a medical redshirt, but obviously that's not what we want to be talking about right now. But when you talk about Dixon, Igbinosun, Loyal, Rogers, and Longerbeam, this is all of their final season of eligibility, assuming they play more than 4 games. So Rutgers has, despite their success at the position, they have done a pretty good job getting guys' feet wet, not just on special teams, but also on the defensive side over the last few years. And when you talk about these guys, Longerbeam, Igbinosun, and Loyal especially, because they've been with the program since they came out of high school, all of them got snaps even before they were starters. And that is what put us in this position now. So when we look at the defensive backs as a whole, they're going to have to earn their reps, some of these younger players. But there are some younger guys, especially in the freshman ranks, that hopefully they can make themselves available to play on the defensive side in key moments and not just in mop-up duty potentially of a blowout. So I'm hopeful that we see someone like Akash Sanders, Antonio White, even if they're freshmen, that they step up and that they can earn reps in meaningful situations, especially earlier in the season. Because if you can do it earlier in the season, then the staff will know what they have moving forward if they do have to get plugged into an emergency situation, or perhaps can take reps from other players and keep everybody fresh. So the last point I'll make about defensive backs is we have seen the Rutgers defensive backfield in the last 25 years at least 3 times be completely decimated coming into a following year and having varying degrees of bounce backs. Obviously, they really, by 2 years later, have always righted the ship. It's been one of the stronger position groups of the program, but there may be some growing pains in the years beyond 2024, no matter what you do this year to get these guys additional reps. It's just trying to make as much of a cushion as you can moving forward.
Yeah, great point. And I think all of this is within the context of, and Shiano has promoted the program as such, as a developmental program. And as you mentioned, a lot of those guys did get reps early on in his tenure, and it's obviously a lot easier to get younger players reps when you're a losing team and you're rebuilding. And now that's the challenge of this year, is that you're at the apex of your development stage. You have so many guys that have been in the program 3-4 years, and now you have to show real results while also keeping an eye on that, furthering that development along with the younger players maybe battling for the two deep the following year. So how did they juggle that and balance that? And I think the secondary is certainly a group that you point to that and say, okay, that's obviously an area you can't be completely green in next year. And how do they handle that situation? Obviously, those first 2 games this season, Howard and Akron, a great opportunity for players to kind of prove themselves in terms of what maybe they can offer throughout the season. Bo Mascow is another player that we've seen a little bit of flashes, I think, that could show up in the secondary this year. What other position groups are jumping out to you in terms of that context?
So then defensive back is definitely a number one because you got to have some sort of plan there. But 2A and 2B, I could see an argument being made for either one would be linebacker and defensive line, which, again, you're just sticking on the defensive side because you've got so many seniors. I guess if you want to talk about linebacker, let's talk about linebacker, because one of the things that Deion Jennings was able to do by being such a good coverage linebacker and a former safety who has since moved on is he was able to cover some tougher assignments than your typical Big Ten linebacker. And so by losing him, you're in a position right now where there may be decisions that have to be made either in scheme or in personnel about how do we make sure that we're not overexposing ourselves in the pass game. We've talked about how last year Rutgers almost was blindsided when they played Maryland in the season finale because it was the first team they had played in months that actually was more of a passing team than a running team. And so what do you do to make sure that, like, are some of your younger guys better in coverage? I mean, we saw Abram Wright make a nice interception in the bowl game, for example. Moses Walker, we're not really sure where his strengths are going to be. So or are you just in a position where you just have to play Tyreen Powell and Mo Toure at the linebacker spots and go from there? So there's a lot of different things that can happen. The one thing about linebacker, which is a pro and a con nowadays, is you really only need 2 guys, which limits the number of snaps that you can give to non-starters or even guys in the 2 deep. But on the flip side, you only need 2. So we've also seen plenty of times where Rutgers linebacking core all aged out. And then again, they've had varying degrees of success the following year as well. I can think of the times where Deontay Roberts and Trevor Morris had to play as sophomores, and they put up a lot of tackles. They weren't nearly the players they would become, but if the defense around them was solid, they would be okay. So hopefully you can get guys to at least that level where they can be passable players in the years beyond based on the experience they're getting this year. Though in a best case scenario, like we've talked about ad nauseum, someone like a Moses Walker steps up and can take starter level responsibilities, which allows you to move Mo Toure around. So to me, that the linebacker spot there's a lot going on. Could have a really, really high ceiling this year, should have a very high floor this year, and that should be true in subsequent years. But there's a lot of decisions that the coaching staff has to make, especially at that spot. Is that how you feel, or do you see that that it's more of dependent on the defensive line as to how things go at linebacker?
Well, I think it's all part of the puzzle, but it's not maybe fair, but I would say, is there a younger player with kind of more riding on their potential and their ability to work out than Moses Walker at linebacker, right? Because if he doesn't take a leap this year and you don't think that he can take that bigger role in that lead linebacker spot the following year, then it is, I think, that position group is a big concern in the middle of that defense, where defensive line, they obviously have to build a rotation, they have to build depth, but there is a pipeline there that you lose a lot there, of course. Aaron Lewis, Wesley Bailey, but I think that that linebacker spot for me, Moses Walker, I would argue, is the most important younger defensive player, just in terms of the future and building around. They really, really, really need him to work out and to be able to assert himself, in that Tyrene Powell type role moving forward. So I would say linebacker, I think you're right, is the most important aside from the secondary group, of course. But in terms of defensive line versus linebacker, I feel like linebacker is an area that can be exposed more so than the defensive line, simply from just a rotational standpoint.
Yeah, the one thing that may be the wild card in all this is the development of the true freshmen. Obviously, you have Sam Piloff, MJ Johnson, as well as Sam Robinson, and so linebacker's a spot where, I mean, if you're awesome, you're going to play. Maybe not as a true freshman. I mean, Steve Longa, who ended up being a great player for Rutgers, multi-year NFL player, he didn't even play as a true freshman. So
Mm-hmm.
don't also panic if a guy is a linebacker who doesn't really play this year. I mean, they said with Longa that if they had to use him, they would have burned his red shirt as a freshman, but they didn't need to because they had a lot of experienced players at that spot at that time. But don't panic. But at the same time, I mean, if one of those guys can play, we're gonna talk about this with some other position groups. You gotta keep your young talent. And if a guy thinks he should be playing, especially nowadays in the transfer portal era and the NIL, like we got to make sure that they're on the field. And
Mm-hmm.
just not just for that player, but it also shows the entire program that, hey, we're willing to play younger players if they are better, not just to play them like we did during the Chris Ash era, but if these players are ready to play, they will get reps. And so I think that there's a lot coming in this freshman class that may offset some of those concerns, but it's a huge wild card because we've never seen them in any sort of action yet, other than training camp upcoming this week will be the first look at those players.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head there too. In terms of 2025, and Rutgers, obviously, having that 24 class as an upgrade now integrated into the program, their first training camp, and now 2025 recruiting class really taking off. Is that opportunity, right? It's not just in terms of the stability of the coaching staff. Shiano's talked about, recruits seeing the fact that they're getting players in the league, they're getting players in the NFL. But there's also now, if you're looking at Rutgers as an option, and you believe in yourself as a player, which all players do, 2025, you could come to Rutgers, and whether you're a second-year player, first-year player, you could end up on the 2D pretty quick. So I think that type of opportunity is a plus in terms of selling yourselves as a developmental program, as a program that we have coaches that have proven we can get guys in the NFL, come here and we can accelerate your development cycle. I think that is a big part of the success you're seeing on the recruiting trail, and also just in terms of the buy-in and why there is reason for optimism with the players that they've brought in with 24 and bringing in with 25.
Absolutely. And that's where the defensive line is so interesting because one of the things that Greg Schiano has talked about is learning from every coach that he has worked under during all of his tenure. And one of the ones that was most recent, obviously, is Urban Meyer. And after Urban Meyer left Ohio State, he really made some good points on some of his breakdowns when they were looking at film. And he talks about how he didn't necessarily love the 4-3 defense, or now what's really more of like a 4-2-5. However, the talented guys want to play defensive end in a four-man front. And so to keep those players happy, to get them encouraged to come to your campus, he felt like he had to run that type of defense. And so when we look at Rutgers right now, they have potentially a lot of star power at those defensive end spots. The defensive line, you also have Malcolm Ray coming in from Florida State, who's going to be out of eligibility. Keontae Hamilton also going to be out of eligibility. So you have all guys in their final year of eligibility in all likelihood that are in that starting group, possibly the entire two deep. So really, when you look at defensive line, it's two things. One, you can't worry about the future at the expense of making sure you can get a pass rush with four. This has been talked about throughout this offseason. We talked about it last year. If Rutgers defense wants to take the next step, the most important thing they need to be able to do is get a better pass rush with only four guys. And so can that come from some of these players now, or is there somebody who emerges as either the heir apparent to Mo Toure as that edge rusher or not? And if not, then do you just lean into your front four as more run stuffers and then have to mess with your linebacking core to just do more blitzing from there? So there's a lot of open questions on this defensive line in the pass game, but if they can all improve, and we're in a good place. When you look at the defensive line, the two deep has a lot of seniors, but if you look at Jordan Thompson, uh, Henry Hughes, Keshawn Griffin potentially, and Zaire Angoy. So you might have four guys who are seniors in their fourth year with the program, but all have additional eligibility because they hadn't played in as many games earlier in their careers. So it's possible that even though they're all seniors, there may be a core of guys that are still with the program a year or even two because of the COVID year in the future. So I'm hopeful, I'm bullish on the defensive line long term, but these guys who are all proven themselves in run defense may need to be supplemented by somebody emerging as another pass rushing threat, especially in the front four. So I don't know who that is. We talked about DJ Allen. Kenny Fletcher's obviously switched sides of the ball. So who is that guy? Is that guy on this team right now? I mean, is there anyone that you think may be able to do that both for 2024 and beyond to add that additional level of explosion off the edge? Or are you just relying on the guys that you have right now that have proven themselves so far?
Well, I think in the context of all this, right? I mean, we know the variable, the X factor that we have no idea how to predict is the transfer portal, right? So you have to imagine. I think you could make the projection that Rutgers arguably could be more active in the transfer portal going into next year to plug certain holes based on the development of the younger players this year and what they have coming in, just to be able to not just be solely reliant on all your youth, because as we know in the Big Ten, that's a slippery slope that could really end up being a detriment. And also just in terms of fostering their own development, right? Just throwing young guys into the fire doesn't always, and a lot of times doesn't work. And we've seen that fail time and time again at Rutgers. So I do think that there's going to be a component to that in terms of the transfer portal and who they add. But I think, like you said, there's certainly a lot of opportunity. I think that's why the first two games of the season are going to be really interesting, because what younger players are going to get spot duty and get those minutes in the second half that can build off of that and prove that. Because if Rutgers can build a 10-man rotation on the defensive line, I think that's the preference. I think we feel like they're probably closer to an 8-man rotation now. So it all depends. But I think there could be, certain options that step up. One guy that you mentioned previously, just going back to linebacker, was Sam Piloff. That's a guy that people forget. I mean, he was locked in with Wisconsin. He's a Wisconsin kid. They were all over him. Obviously, some off the field issues happened, but that's a Big Ten linebacker talent right there. So maybe he ultimately converts the defensive line on that edge. It all depends, but I think they have options. But it's really going to be a blend of everything, and how much can the staff get a read. It's not just about the players getting an opportunity, but just in terms of how is the staff evaluating the younger players and how much confidence they have. That's why next spring, of course, is going to be so crucial. But how active are they going to be after the season in the transfer portal, and how active are they going to be after spring practice? Those are certainly variables that are going to make a big impact on the 25 roster also.
For sure. And I guess that kind of leads us into flipping to the offensive side, because really, when you look at the offensive line, Holland Pierce is far and away your most important player. So he's the only guy who you can say consistently week in and week out is above average as position. And after him, Gus Salinskis has seemed like a reliable center. Obviously, the fact that he overtook Ireland Brown last year and had a good season speaks volumes to how the staff felt about him, because we all felt Ireland Brown was a more than capable center himself, and clearly NFL talent evaluators agree with us. So Zelinskis will have additional eligibility past this year, but now you're running into an interesting situation where if he has a really good season, it's possible that he might decide to, leave early. I wouldn't say really leave early because he's a senior, but he would have eligibility left that he would be foregoing if he was to go that route. So on the offensive line, we're back to this situation where who's going to be the left tackle? Perhaps it's someone who's playing on the right side now. We talk about all these guys battling on the right side, like your Tyler Needhams or Shedrick Rhodes, who may be battling for a starting spot there. Could one of them ultimately move over to the left side? Does someone like Taj White, who has been the backup left tackle, does he take another step in his development? there are a lot of guys on the offensive line who can earn opportunities now. Shiano has talked about he'd prefer going with 5, but what we've seen every year since he's been back is they've really had more of like a 6 or 7 man rotation, because there's
Mhm.
always been a rotation, I think, at right guard the entire time. And in terms of other spots, we have seen guys get action. And so, unless you prove yourself as you're head and shoulders above the next guy, they have been rotating people around, moving players from positions in season. There's been a lot of moving parts on there. And despite all that, they were still a pretty good offensive line last year. So I think we have to have confidence in the coaching staff's ability to both scheme as well as put in the right personnel as well as develop guys. I mean, there's no position on a field that's more of a developmental position than offensive line, and they have bodies that have high level upside, even without factoring in the guys that may be coming in the next recruiting class that may be coming in on offensive or defensive line. I don't even want to talk about them because really they're a couple of years away, no matter how high of a prospect they are. Even if 4-star guy, only guy on offensive line that we've really ever seen play really well as a freshman was Caleb Johnson. I mean, even Anthony Davis, who became an NFL first round draft pick, had some growing pains as a freshman. The only other guy I remember playing as a true freshman, actually, Brian Felter played a little bit in that 2020 season, but it was Art Forst who played, and he was okay, but he wasn't like a difference maker. So really, what we need to see is some of these guys from the Rutgers lower classes, Oliveira maybe, Rivera maybe. We talked about how Kobe Asamoah's class has kind of fallen apart for the most part in terms of a lot of guys having medical issues. So who is it? I have confidence that the staff will find somebody, but the question is, can they grow enough even if those guys aren't playing on the field the fall this season? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I think that Coach Flaherty deserves the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, absolutely, and you're right. There's nothing better than real live reps, but they do have that pipeline, in the program, learning the system now. You're right. You can't rely on 2025, even though, from a star rankings, all that, the talent coming in with 25 is a significant upgrade, but you can't rely on them for next year. And I think you have to give the benefit of the doubt to Flaherty and Scott Vallone, who's now coaching the tight ends, just in terms of the impact he's had on offensive line as well, just in terms of their development and what will emerge from there. I think it is an obvious position that you could see them active in the transfer portal also. But that in that point about Zelenkus, it's kind of like some people will call it like the victim of your own success. But I would
Right.
argue that it's actually exactly what you want to be able to sell to recruits, is that, look, we took this guy, he wasn't a starter, we made him a starter, now he's leaving early to be in the NFL, come here and the same can happen to you. So I think even if that happens, sure, from a depth perspective, it'd be great to have him in 25 as well to anchor that line. But at the same time, there is a benefit as well if that development process almost accelerates faster than anyone, or hits a level that no one saw coming. So there's a lot of ways you can look at it, but certainly offensive line is, they've gotten it to a point where they're competent. We hope this year they take it even another step. But then you're right, you can't have 3 steps backward next season, and that would be that's a huge factor in where this offense goes this season and beyond, in terms of Shiraka now having all his handprints on everything. We could transition now into quarterback, Aiden Kalik-Manis. We would the goal obviously would be for him to have a very good year, and then to be able to come back and have an even better year in 25. What's your outlook in terms of that position?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing is nothing is set long term at the quarterback position anymore. I think Rutgers has done what they can to be more stable than other programs, but that's a pretty low bar considering like how many, I think it was like 40 of the Power 5 teams have a new starting quarterback this year. It might be higher than that. It's
Wow.
something ridiculous. It's at least 2/3 if I remember right. And so, yeah, Cali Manis, you hope he comes back. A lot of things can happen with quarterback. Obviously, protection is a huge factor. We didn't see Gavin Wimsatt have to run away from too much pressure, but I
Mm-hmm.
think one of the reasons for that is because defenses were playing the run first and they weren't as worried about him tucking and running And so one of the things you can't do as a defense so Wimsatt had the physical ability to run, but we saw more of design runs from him than, tuck it on 3rd and 5. What we're going to see from Kelly Manis is he's going to take some of those plays where on 3rd and 6 you call a pass play and you hope that if there's, an open space, he tucks it and he runs, which may lead to potential injuries, which may make your offensive line a little bit more exposed in certain areas. And so there's a lot of things that can go into this, but at the end of the day, if you can get better quarterback play this year than you got last year, that tells you a lot about both the individual player, the coach, as well as making it an attractive destination for recruits as well as possible transfers. And I don't mean like just replacing with a star level quarterback. I don't think Rutgers has the money to do that, but just so that if a quarterback sees a situation where they feel like, hey, Rutgers has the infrastructure in place, they're going to protect me. Maybe I'm, a second or maybe I'm a number 3 quarterback in another Big Ten team that's stuck in a logjam. Maybe it's an attractive destination for me. And so Kelly Manis, it's kind of interesting because kind of like we talked about with Ja'Kuri Brown last year in that bowl game, the consensus was if he played really, really well, maybe that made it less likely he was going to stick around at Miami, but then also make it more likely that other guys are going to come to Miami. So again, we haven't heard anything about Kelly Manis like loving Rutgers, not loving Rutgers, nothing like that. But I'm just saying that the better he does, the more of an attractive place it's going to be for everybody else that's an offensive player at any position. And so I'm curious there, but more interesting to me at the quarterback is just where do they feed the ball around? I think we're starting to see with their tight end recruiting that they view tight end more as a blocking position and that they're going to try to feed more mouths at receiver where possible. And so they have a lot of guys at receiver. The big X factor, though, for this year is Demir Miller, who's going to be out of eligibility heading into next year. And so I think I'm looking at it more of like a passing game as a whole and the cohesion amongst the group. There's a lot of younger players. You are going to lose Miller. You are going to lose Brantley. You are going to lose Dremel all at the end of this year. Again, kind of like we're talking about on defense, barring like a medical redshirt situation. So Chris Long may be back, but who does he develop chemistry with that is sustainable both within this year as well as beyond? That's really a big question when I look at the offense as a whole, probably the biggest question for the entire group. At receiver, we can talk about the individual names, but there's just a lot of guys who have flashed, and I don't know who is going to emerge, but I probably feel better about the wide receiver position than I have felt in over a decade, probably at this point, because of the amount of guys. Since you go back to that core group of Harrison, Sanu, Coleman coming through the ranks, probably since 2011. This is probably the most guys who I feel like could be a Big Ten starter at the position.
Yeah, excellent points. And I spoke about it in my recent podcast, just talking about Rutgers being the trendy sleeper pick. As Greg Schiano said in an interview at Big Ten Media Day with Kings of the North, that, the wide receiver group was going to be able to do some things that they haven't been able to do. I think the key there is with Shiraka in terms of his play calling, being a little bit more aggressive. And that all ties to accuracy. Shiano talked about, how many yards after catch they felt that they left on the table last year just because Wimsatt was unable to be as accurate as they needed him to be. And that it wasn't even as much of how much growth they have, in the deep passing game. It's how much more efficient can they be in the short passing game to be able to give those receivers an opportunity to make plays in open space. So I think that's a big part of it. And you're right, it is infectious in that if offensive players start to see this, and they obviously are believing in the vision, right? Because you have 4-star receivers that have already committed now in the 25 and 26 class, which is a bit unprecedented for Rutgers. So they're obviously selling a vision that everyone's believing in, and this is the year that you can really show, hey, this is our vision. Here it is on film on what we're actually doing and what we want to do moving forward. So that's an exciting prospect for sure, just in terms of how it all comes together. And I think having the potential to have Kelly Manis accelerate the offense and then be back another year provides a key stability to a group that's going to need to be able to build off of whatever they're able to accomplish this year, especially with such a potentially inexperienced defense in 2025.
Yeah, I mean, you see this a lot with teams, even at the pro level. They're kind of defense first, build up your defense, and then the offense starts to come along. And then at some point, guys either age out, even in the NFL, or they, in their case, take bigger contracts elsewhere. And so your team kind of flips between having gone from a defensive team to an offensive team. It can happen in reverse, but usually that's the more common way of doing it. And so there's going to be I mean, there's a lot of pressure to win this year, but there's going to be a lot of pressure on the key offensive returning players in the subsequent years because they're going to have to score more points, period.
Yep.
For sure. I do think, to your point about the yards after the catch, when I listen to the national pundits, there are some that have Rutgers as, like you said, a sneaky sleeper pick for the playoff. They were not listed in this morning's ESPN 30 teams that can make the playoff. So I'm happy about that. The hype train is not completely out of control. But at the same time, when you talk about the difference between Wimsatt and Kaliakmanis, people keep saying if they're a Big Ten person, like he was not good last year, he's not good last year, he's not good last year. That's fine. I rewatched every throw that he made last year, and yes, he had some of those throws that you saw with Gavin where guys open and you're just like, why is this ball nowhere near the person? It just looks like it comes out of his hand bad or whatever. But what I did see consistently was those checkdowns to running backs, even receivers against the zone, where if you can just complete this ball, a lot of times it's like 2nd and 10, defense is way back, just get 5-6 yards and then live to, have a 3rd and manageable. Or on 1st down, sometimes you run a play action and the deep guys aren't open, but you can just check it down to a running back or again, even a receiver or a tight end leaking out and just get 5 yards. So it's 2nd and 5 instead of 2nd and 10 or 2nd and 8 because of a late decision that you make to tuck and run and avoid a sack. So all those things that I don't think people from the outside realize how Rutgers was not able to complete these basic plays. And if you can do that, then you can find out how good your playmakers are after the catch. We don't even know because for the most part, like you said, Rutgers didn't have a lot. We saw one big play from Christian Dremel against Michigan. How many other big plays after the catch do we see like that last year? Not a lot. And so it's possible that these guys are already on the roster, and perhaps with slightly better accuracy, we'll be able to see that at a higher level. And that bodes well in the future because, again, to score points, you need explosive plays. And Rutgers is going to have to score more points as these years go on. And so I think they have some guys, but we'll find out who they are. And we're really going to see separating the men from the boys. Hopefully, it's already started in training camp, but we're going to see it early in the season for sure.
Yeah, and you hit my point exactly. That pod's not even out yet as we're recording this, but that was my reason for optimism in that with all the hype, if you can just do that one thing better offensively, it is you see a path to be able to meet the hype. Because if the offense can take a significant step forward in doing one, I don't want to say basic, but if they could just be more efficient in the short passing game and be more explosive because of that. Again, you're not asking them to complete 3 or 4 deep balls every game. You're talking about, within 10 yards, can you be closer to 65, 70%? Can you deliver the ball in space for guys to make plays? If they can just do that, the offense is going to be so much better and gives hope and real reason backing up the hype of why I think they can, get up to that 8 plus 9, 10, whatever. We'll see. But it's not a pipe dream in terms of if they can do that one thing better. Wanted to talk about, lastly, running backs before we look at the 25 schedule and give any closing thoughts here. Just obviously in terms of Sam Brown potentially could be back. Shiano's talked about Jashawn Benjamin. Kyle Monunga has talked about Jashawn Benjamin entering his 2nd year, and then you have a slew of freshmen behind them. Thoughts on running back post Kyle Monunga after the 24 season?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one because you have to frame it like the Ray Rice situation that they had in terms of running back is not a quote premium position. But when you have a guy who's basically the engine of your offense that is tough to bring down, that is basically the heart and soul of the offense, who plays bigger than he is, all those things, that is a premium skill. That sure it's not a premium position, but you need somebody on the offense who is that guy. Sometimes it's your quarterback, sometimes it's a running back, sometimes it's a receiver, right? But who is that guy? And we would like to think that it's Sam Brown. But at the same point, even as things have changed throughout college football, one thing remains true. If you're a junior running back with good measurables and good production, even average production, that's the time to go to the NFL. In the case of Kyle Monangai, the reason he didn't meet that bill is one, because obviously he was not a surefire even draft pick, and he's the heart and soul of this team. All those things. He doesn't have the measurables that a Sam Brown has. So if Sam Brown, even if he's your number 2 running back this year, runs for, let's say, 500, 600 yards, there's a good chance that his best opportunity, especially with his previous injury, would be to leave to go to the NFL. Obviously, that's a best case scenario, kind of like we're talking about with Zelinskis. Like, this is a good problem to have, that players are moving on at that level. But so even if, let's say, you don't have Monangai and Brown in the 2025 season, you still have guys who may be able to get a little bit of a role this year, like we saw with Benjamin last year. You have all these freshmen who hopefully are going to play some on special teams. And running back is a position where you can kind of go down the line and say, okay, Benjamin's our guy in this role. Antoine Raymond's our guy in this role. Gabe Winovich is this guy in this role. Ed Guerrero might carry in these situations. And maybe they don't all play every week, but it's a position where you can get production. The thing that they're going to be missing is that heart and soul, even if it's not necessarily a bell cow back, but that go-to guy on offense. Last year, Kyle Monangai is ripping off 3rd and 7 runs against Michigan State to put that game away. It's 3rd and 7. They don't even expect to convert, but he is just willing himself and willing their team to win. And when you look at that, that's my bigger concern is more of the offense as a whole. Who is that guy going to be beyond 2024? Can you figure out who that guy is this year? That's really hard to do. It's really hard to figure out who your second heart and soul is, because it doesn't work like that. The body's only got one heart, right? And so, but can they figure out who might be 3 or 4 guys that might be that guy moving forward? That's really my big question. And honestly, we didn't really talk about it, but I don't really think it's going to be a tight end. Maybe that's something we have moving forward in the future. But right now, I mean, those guys are in there to block, and whatever you can get from them, especially after the catch, I think is really what we're going to start seeing. We're going to see inline blocking and more leak outs from the tight ends to get, check down yardage that we just have not seen for years. And that's really what I would expect from the tight end position. Maybe longer term, one of these guys hits and they're, a Tyler Croft. But for the meantime, I don't see that from their spot. Really, the biggest question for me on offense in 2025 and beyond is who is going to replace Kyle Monangai as the guy? Any thoughts on who that might be, or am I putting too much stock in that idea?
No, I think it's your best point of this episode, and the best point, and that's not to slight your other points, but it's such an excellent point in terms of the way he carried Rutgers last year, with knockout blows against Virginia Tech, Miami, Michigan State, as you mentioned. That you can't. That's not a statistic. That's not a measurement. That just manifests itself in something that Rutgers had that nobody even really knew they had going into this season. Right. So it is so important. I mean, you were talking about the young running backs you mentioned. You also have John Forster potentially coming in and commit in the 25 class. A lot of potential there. French 4-star. So who knows what impact he could potentially make next year. But yeah, I mean, it could be. I mean, listen, I do have high hopes for Winovich in the pass game as a running back. But I think it might not be a like for like, right? It might not be a one for one. You might just have to find pieces here, pieces there. And I think that goes back to the emphasis of why Cali McManus creating stability at the quarterback position is really important, because you don't have that staple in Monangai in 25. But if you have a quarterback that can orchestrate and direct and get multiple guys involved and get production from multiple guys, that might be enough to replace that one guy. Obviously, the heart and soul part, that's something that's just going to have to come about naturally. And I think it's kind of impossible to predict, giving myself a way out on that question. But in terms of, if you can allow players to use their ability and to make plays, then all of that kind of comes together as well. So I think having a quarterback, be stable and to be able to get multiple guys involved and put them in a position to make plays, something that Rutgers hasn't had. And that's why Monangai is such a saving grace. And there's no disrespect to Wimsett, but he wasn't able to do that for the offense. So Monungai was able to kind of save the day and be the superhero moment. I think the goal really is to not have to be so reliant on that type of role in the future, and to be more unpredictable, to be more diverse, to be have more depth in terms of guys that can take over a game. And that's what we saw, in Schiano 1.0, right? I mean, a guy like Tim Brown that became a superhero, and nobody was kind of expecting him to, when he had all this, perceived better talent on the roster. You have other guys that aren't as much the focal point that can then step up and deliver that knockout punch too. So I think for Rutgers to ultimately move up in the Big Ten, that's what you have to have is 3-4 guys that can deliver that knockout blow, not just the one that Rutgers has that everyone knows is coming and still able to deliver it. So I think that's a big key moving forward.
Absolutely. And I think if we want to talk a little bit about looking at the schedule, we know Rutgers has gotten a good draw in 2024. It's possible that they may not play a ranked team all season. It's possible. And that's coming off of playing at least 3 ranked teams, probably at least 4 ranked teams every year for years. I mean, 2020 season may be an exception. That was kind of a weird one. But when you look at 2025 and we talk about, Ohio State's going to be back on the schedule. Penn State's going to be back on the schedule. They do avoid Michigan, but they are going to have to play Oregon at home and then go back out to Washington. Now, we know Washington's going to be a better team in 2025 than they're in 2024. Absolutely. With all the turnover, players, coaches, and everything like that. The schedule in 2025, again, it's impossible to say for sure. But you are going to be facing, in all likelihood, a lot of teams that will be better in 25 than they are in 24. Maybe with the exception of Ohio State, because if they win the national title, it's only downhill from there in 2024. So beyond that, I mean, what does this mean? I think the takeaway that I've made many times and over is that to beat these better teams with more talent, you need playmakers on both sides of the ball. If you can't get a pass rush with 4 against an average Big Ten team, it's not happening against the upper echelon squads. And so these difference makers, these dynamic players, are even more important the more you reach those sort of games, either late in your season or in a subsequent year against better competition. And so that's really, when I look at this, I mean, that's one of the reasons there's a lot of pressure on Rutgers winning this year, is because the schedule lines up pretty well. Because even you could play really, really well and lose all 4 of those games, and then you're already at 4 losses in 2025. Like, there's no teams on this schedule this year where I feel like if Rutgers plays their best game, they won't win. And that is really the difference between, the subsequent schedules that they have coming up. I mean, is that really, where did you want to go with this thought about the schedules moving forward in an expanded conference?
Yeah, well, I think you made some really good points there. I think one point I'm going to hammer home now into oblivion, and I brought up on my last pod in terms of meeting those expectations as the trendy sleeper pick, is that your developmental program, you bill yourself as a developmental program. This is the year you have to show real results, whether that means 8, 9, 10, whatever wins. You have to meet that minimum, I think, of that 8 win mark, to show that we've taken the next step forward and we're going to continue to build. Now all our veterans are gone. We have all this opportunity for, better talent to come in and take it to the next level. But that's why you need to hit this year in some way, whatever that measurement ultimately is. They have to show real results this year to continue that positive momentum with the development. And as you said, the schedule is a lot harder next year. In terms of the schedule that I wanted to point out, was a lot of their, on paper, winnable games are on the road. So in terms of the Big Ten, Illinois, Minnesota, Purdue, all 3 of those games on paper, you would say, okay, they have those are 50-50 games right now. Just say they're all on the road. You have Penn State and Oregon at home. You have also Iowa at home also. So the home schedule is a lot tougher next year versus last year. You already mentioned in terms of at Washington and at Ohio State. So there's a lot of monster games, not to mention there's one non-conference game still to be scheduled, likely an FCS team But you have double MACtion now. Announced last week they added Miami of Ohio. You open with Ohio. I mean, the MAC is no joke. Those aren't the easiest games. I kind of love that they're playing two MAC teams. That probably means they're not going to add a Power 4 team. You'll add an FCS team with two MAC teams, but certainly a much more difficult schedule next year. But again, I think it just bringing back the emphasis to 24 and how it impacts 25 is to continue to keep that forward momentum with recruiting. You're obviously selling the NFL factor and having a lot of guys from this team jump to the NFL next year, but it's also the results you show as a team in the Big Ten this season to say, hey, come to Rutgers, get that opportunity very quickly, and we can build and take this thing to the next level. And that's so important as a developmental program to show the fruits of that development this year. So you get better talent to believe that, hey, we can take that even farther moving forward. Any thoughts there, and just closing thoughts in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think like you're saying, we need to see the top end talent start rising up, and building confidence starts with this season because it's really important for the team as a whole to just stay together. And we talk about extending your season. Just extending into bowl season was the step last year. How do you extend it to really playing more meaningful games late in the year? Whether that means you think you're in the hunt for the college football playoff or not. Just big time games, where big crowd, national interest, that type of thing. How do they get there? That's really the step this year, because long term, like we said, you're gonna need the equivalents of your, like you mentioned, the Kenny Britt. You're gonna need those equivalent guys who he wasn't a starter early in the season on that 2016, but you saw at the end of the year, like, okay, this is the guy who gives us reason to believe that we're going to be able to beat big time teams moving forward, that type of thing. And so, that who are those guys in this class? Who in this group? Who are those guys? I don't know, right? Even we look at, like, in the past, Brendan Rankert came on as a low 3-star. He might have not even been a scholarship player, and then all of a sudden, like, he emerges and plays in the NFL. Like, later in his career, who are those guys? Maybe they don't even play as a freshman like Kenny Britt, but maybe they break out as a sophomore or junior. Who Kyle Monangai types? Who are the next guys like that? And ideally you want them to be very big, fast, and strong. But who are those guys? And then I would be remiss talking about 2025 to not give a mention to the Rutgers Rant contributors, Pat Lanny and Brian Fonseca, who were concerned that they almost had a 12-hour layover in Charlotte after Big Ten Media Days. So if that's to happen in the 2025 season, obviously they should reach out to me. It's 15 minutes away from my house, and I'm more than willing to, show them around. And Brian pode conversar con meu sogro sobre Messi, Pele y Ronaldo, enquanto Lanny joga NCAA football 2014 and PlayStation 3. So they're more than willing to come over, and if they like it so much, they can also know I'm a real estate agent. I can hook them up with a place to live if they like it that much and they never want to go back to New Jersey. So good job on the Rutgers Rant in the off season from those guys. But hey, no reason to slight Charlotte and North Carolina at this point in time.
I'm with you there. I have family from there, and I visited many times as a kid. So that was very funny. And just to your last point, that is an excellent point in relevance to all of this discussion. Is it's not just about increasing the talent and the depth, but generating those diamonds in the rough, right? Can the staff continue to churn out recruits that maybe did not come in with the same level of buzz, that can become real-time contributors, starters, that can further along the development of this program? It's not just about making the 4 stars work. It's about continuing to find talent within your own roster and fostering that talent that are under the radar coming into the program. I think that's a key. Talking about the heart and soul of the team, I think that's a key fabric piece of the culture of the program. Shiano talking this week about the loss of walk-ons moving forward with the scholarship limits now going up, that he thinks that's going to be kind of the detriment of that new rule, regardless of how Rutgers approaches it moving forward. So I think it's going to be very important to the culture of the program moving forward, of how they are able to still keep that aspect of it because that's how, the Iowas of the world, right? That's how they've always succeeded as well, in terms of having those under the radar guys become big time contributors, along with whatever talent they have. And I think for Rutgers, that's going to be a key moving forward.
Absolutely. On Off Tackle Empire, we actually had a post this week about Iowa football predictions. Do they even matter? Because that's a program that just basically goes 8-5 every year. And so the thought I had was, I'm actually more excited to be, following a program like Rutgers where there is some uncertainty, good, bad, or indifferent. That this could go a lot of different ways right now, and we're hoping for the best. But we've talked about some of the ways that it can reach its potential. But yeah, you want to be Iowa, but at the same point, it's actually kind of exciting to not be Iowa. And so that's what we'll have our eye on in this upcoming 2024 season, where, I mean, I'm not saying I'm counting down the days because I'm in a good spot in my life now, playing with my kids, but part of it's because I'm nervous about this season. I don't want it to come in that regard, but at the same time, like it's going to be a really interesting one for Rutgers football on the field in 2024.
It's going to be a wild ride. Stick with us at the Scarlet Faithful podcast. Great analysis as always from David Anderson. Thanks so much for your time again. We'll have a lot of season preview action coming up in this month in August. Now 4 weeks away, a little bit less from the season opener against Howard on August 29th. Thanks so much for listening and watching here once again at the Scarlet Faithful podcast.